Okay, hold on. 1, 2, 3. Let me check the mic. Waiting for a bit. Just waiting. If audio goes fine. Okay, audio goes fine. Okay, I'll put the intro, and in 30 seconds we are going to start. Welcome to another TROM-Cast, number 62. Today we are going to talk about mental disorders, or diseases or illnesses, depending how you label them or if it's relevant to even label them. We will see today. Before we start, you can send us questions at tromsci.com/chat if you are interested to ask any questions. And before we start talking to our guest today, because I'm extremely excited to talk to our guest today, let me, in a few minutes, 2-3 minutes, explain why I got so interested in this topic and why our project is it emerged a bit from my curiosity about this topic. I've experienced a lot of problems for all of my life, like some 15 or so years, some that you may call as depression or extreme anxiety. Like, I remember I was so, let's call me depressed, that I locked myself in my own room. I lost all my friends. For many years, or I had this anxiety. I remember I liked to drink Coca-Cola, for example, and to buy a bottle of Coca-Cola, I had to go around the city to not meet with anyone because I was so, like, my anxiety was skyrocketing. I didn't want to meet with anyone. Just go around the city for half an hour or so to buy a bottle of Coca-Cola and come back into my little crib and then just close myself there. You know, I had suicidal thoughts. I even tried to commit suicide at least one time, and I did close to that. Extreme headaches, I had insomnia. Like, I was going to school without sleeping, like not even 5 minutes. I was going to school like that. So I went through a lot of distress, basically all of my life. You know, I had panic attacks, for example, so powerful that I had to pinch myself to feel pain in order to get rid of the panic attack, because I felt like I was suffocating myself, you know. So I had a lot of stress in my life for, let's say, 7 or 8 years, more intense for 3 or 4 years, quite intense actually. I had lots of problems. And I got interested in the subject of mental disorders. I got to read online about these diseases, and I was curious, you know, do I have these diseases? What are they based upon? Like, did they find anything in the brain, in the genes, in any chemicals in your body? And I got more and more interested in this topic, and I realized that overall human behavior seems to come from the environment, meaning people are not just born hating black people or being stressed or wanting to do this or that. They learn from the environment, and their values come from there. And if you change that, maybe you can change the behavior. And then I changed my environment. Luckily, I came from Romania to Spain, and I changed the environment completely, and I kind of cured, let's say, all of these things. Now I'm perfectly fine. You know, I even had in the past Tourette-like symptoms that I couldn't control, all kinds of twitches, all kinds of crazy things like that I couldn't control. But I realized how powerful it is when you change the environment, and that's why I even created this TROM project that we have. Because I said, if you look at the society, our problems, where are they coming from? Most of the problems, you know, we are human beings doing all kinds of things, corruption, and they are violent, or they have all kinds of stress. And this, where does it come from? Well, probably comes from the environment, and we should look at the environment. And that's our core message in our project. Now, look at the environment if you want to understand human beings, human behavior. So today we are going to focus a lot on this notion of a mental disorder or a disease. In a way, I wanted to make a series of TROM-Casts about human behavior. This will be one. I want to make another one about male or female brain. You know, people say that there are such things, a male or female brain, or some about sexuality, some about violence. I want to invite all kinds of experts in the field. And luckily, I managed to invite 2, I would say, experts in the field of mental disorders that I've been following for many years now. And I'm extremely happy we have Lucy Johnston and Joanna Moncrieff. And if you can please tell us, let's start with Joanna, if you can please tell us a bit about yourself, your work, who are you, basically?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me on. So I'm a psychiatrist, that's the first thing to say. I work in the UK. So I have a clinical practice in the NHS with people who have what are sometimes referred to as severe mental disorders. They've usually had a diagnosis of something like schizophrenia or severe depression or personality disorder. And I work in a community mental health team trying to support them. And then I'm also an academic at University College London. And the reason that you've invited me is I've got a long-standing interest in psychiatric drugs in particular, a critical interest in psychiatric drugs. And I've particularly been questioning sort of mainstream assumptions about what psychiatric drugs do. So ideas like the idea that antidepressants correct a chemical imbalance and that depression is a chemical imbalance that can be treated and cured by taking a pill. And I've got a broader interest in the nature of what we refer to as mental disorders as well. I've known Lucy for quite a long time, and we have similar a similar critique of again the mainstream view that these disorders are medical conditions that can be thought of and treated in the same way as you might think of and treat an episode of pneumonia or something like that. So is that enough for now, or do you want me to go on?
I think so. It's enough for now because we are going into all kinds of details afterwards. And Lucy, if you can please tell us about yourself a little bit.
Hi, thank you for inviting us. So I'm Lucy Johnston. I'm a clinical psychologist. So unlike Joanna, I'm not medically trained, but like Joanna, I've worked in mental health settings for many, many years with adults and with people with a range of diagnoses, including the more severe end of the spectrum, things like so-called schizophrenia and so-called personality disorders and so on. I'm currently describing myself as an independent trainer, so I'm kind of self-employed at the moment. And I've got a very long-standing, there's a theme that goes throughout my work, dating back many, many years now, which is of being very critical of the diagnostic and medical model of distress, similar to Joanna, coming from a slightly different training background and so on. And I'm interested in alternatives. I'm interested in a form of co-constructing stories about people's lives, which is called formulation, which is something psychologists do a lot of in the UK, which I see as alternative diagnosis. I'm interested more generally in alternatives to the medical model of distress. And for the last 6 or 7 years or so, my focus, and this is what I'm doing full time now, I seem to have turned into a trainer in the power threat meaning framework, which is we're going to come on to talk about, but it's a very ambitious co-produced project, multi-author project, which outlines an alternative to the diagnostic model of distress, because I think we urgently need to move on from that. And it's perhaps worth saying that I think in the UK, more than other countries, at least as far as I can gather, there is quite a strong critique of diagnostic and medical models, which seems to be less evident in other places I've travelled to, other places that I know about. And I think Joe and I are part of a large, loose group of people who all tend to know each other. There's conferences, who often co-author articles, who appear on similar podcasts and so on, who take overlapping but essentially rather similar perspectives, which boil down to what we're doing isn't working and we need to change it. And I guess we may differ a bit in the extent to which we think things need to change, but I think fundamentally we're coming from the same position.
Perfect, thank you. And yes, because the general idea, or if you read most of these popular websites, or even if you search on YouTube what is depression and so forth, you will come across definitions like it's a chemical imbalance, it has some genetical traits and so forth, all kinds of these definitions that go towards this biomedical model that is something, it's almost like a broken arm, or it's like diabetes, or it's like cancer. Everybody seems to peddle this kind of notion. But before we talk about if it's true or not, who came up with the idea to label human behavior? Because if you think about it, it's a bit bizarre, at least in my perspective, to label human behavior from here to there in a way, and being a disease or being a problematic type of behavior. Who came up with these notions of labeling human behavior and calling it a disorder or disease? If you can, any of you can.
So that's a really big question, and obviously it was not one person who came up with this idea, and I think the roots go back to the 18th and 19th century, when there was competition for who would look after people in the emerging asylum system. So in the UK and elsewhere, a system of institutions was being built to manage people who seemed to be behaving irrationally and whose behavior was disruptive, and who were preventing other people from being shepherded into the labor force of the emerging industrial capitalist society, in England in particular. And so from the beginning, some of these asylums were run by medically qualified people, but not all of them. And there was some competition in the 19th century between medically qualified people and other people as to who should be in charge of these new institutions. And basically, the doctors won out, and I think they won out partly because they had a nice, simple story to tell. You know, this is a disease, and we can do something about it. And I think it's still the case that is part of the appeal of the medical model. It just seems very simple, and the alternatives, you know, if you reject the medical model, actually it's much more complicated. If you think this is not a disease, this is how some people are, and maybe how they've become because of things that have happened to them, that's a very complicated, messy area, especially if you're thinking about behavior that's, you know, socially problematic and something that you might want to change or control. So this idea, I think, has origins back in the 19th century about in professional competition, but has survived for many reasons, but partly because it's so simple and therefore appealing. But
in a way, trying to adapt people to the society rather than the society to people.
Yeah. I mean, so one view about how the kind of diagnostic medical labeling model arose is that it's not an accident that it emerged at the same time as industrialization and particular economic structures were emerging, which, you know, didn't necessarily fit very well with, you know, how people, what healthy or, you know, supportive ways in which people had lived for centuries, probably longer than that. And what do we do with these social casualties, in essence? Well, it's quite convenient to be able to bundle them up and label them and put them in asylums and assign them to a particular profession to kind of sort out. It is, as Joanna says, very threatening to start to make the links back, not just the, you know, difficult things that happen in your life in terms of your relationships, but in terms of the social context. So there are huge drivers, I think, to, I mean, power threat meaning terms, we would call it separate the threat from the threat response, separate the personal distress from the roots, as I would see it, that ultimately lie in the whole way we structure societies and the beliefs and assumptions we have and the ways we have of shaming, isolating, excluding, marginalizing, silencing people who don't fit in.
Yeah.
This is a kind of, sometimes think, although as you started off by saying this is accepted truth, isn't it? You read this stuff on websites all over the place, but if you stand back a bit, it's a kind of blip. It's a blip in human history. It's been around, perhaps the dominant model for about 150 years. It's a tiny period, and only in largely Western cultures, although we're engaged in the process of exporting it across the world, which I think is a very bad thing. It's a blip, it's truth. I strongly believe we will emerge out the other end, and I think that's what's happening. But at the moment, it's very powerful, and at the moment, it's the only options most people are offered. Indeed, they may be punished for pursuing different options. So it has the power of, you know, it's by the scientific language and so on, which gives it extra credibility. That's where we are at present.
Yeah, some people may even think that maybe this is maybe it's a bit of a conspiracy. Like, really, did they invent these things to keep people in line, kind of? But maybe it's not exactly like that, or maybe it is. However, I came across all kinds of previously said to be mental disorders, like I remember drapetomania, I think, or something like when slaves were running away from their owners, they suffered from a mental disorder, or even homosexuality not long ago was classified as a mental disorder. And how come these things come and go? I mean, a disease is a disease, right? If you classify it as a disease, you cannot change that just by voting. And I was seeing these videos with Thomas Saz, who is one of the biggest maybe criticizers of this model. And he was saying that when they dropped the label for homosexuality as being a disorder or a disease, they did not know anything that they didn't know 1,000 years ago. They just voted to include or not include this kind of disorder. So this is how they define them. They just observe the behavior and then define that this is a depression, this is schizophrenia, and so forth. That's mainly what they do.
Yeah, and it's obviously it's a completely different process from when you're diagnosing an episode of pneumonia or liver cancer or whatever it is, when you're looking at what's going on in the body. You're looking at physical evidence of something that's happening in a physical object that is the human body. As you say, when people diagnose a medical disorder, they're just actually making a judgment about some form of behavior and deciding whether or not it's acceptable behavior or not acceptable behavior. And therefore, of course, norms change over time and depending on context. So what appears to be unusual in one setting is not necessarily unusual in another. And many so-called mental disorders come and go. Even over the last 20 or 30 years, you can see how certain disorders have been created or promoted or sort of played up, often by the pharmaceutical industry when they've got a new drug that they want to sell, but not always. And other ones have faded away and become less popular.
I mean, essentially, we're talking about social judgments dressed up as medical judgments, and I think it's particularly clear in some cases, like homosexuality. We can look back now and say that's ridiculous. Drapetomania, what a kind of crazy kind of label is that? We can see it's a social judgment, not a medical judgment. I think the trick is to see how, as I would see it, all so-called functional diagnoses, and diagnosis isn't actually the correct word, but all the labels are essentially based on social judgments. So we've had a huge rise in so-called borderline personality disorder, haven't we? I never met anyone with that label at the start of my career. Angry women with BPD, and things often look very far. And in fact, you can look at the criteria for any DSM or ICD diagnosis and see that they're actually kind of social judgments dressed up as inappropriate, angry, or things that clearly rely on a set of implicit norms about how angry, for example, women should be, particularly women who've very often got a long history of trauma and abuse.
But all of this to me seems extraordinary for me from the outside to learn and accept that the only way that they categorize these disorders, and in many cases they call them diseases or illnesses, is just by observing the behavior. To me, it seems a bit like a con artist, a scientific con artist in a way, because where is your science then? How can you do that? How is that acceptable? How we became acceptable then and be labeled as science if that's what you are doing?
Good question.
Yeah. And it's really I think it's very misleading for people as well. That's what really worries me. So because we call it diagnosis and because we present these so-called diagnoses as if they are something like a medical illness, people think that when you tell them they've got depression, that that you're pinpointing something that's wrong with their brain. Whereas actually what you are doing, even if what you are doing according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is just telling them what they're telling you. You're saying, okay, you've described to me that you're not feeling great, that you're not doing your usual activities, and you're just giving a label to what they've told you. You're not doing any more than that. And yet I think people have this idea that you are, that you're somehow you're telling them something's wrong with their bodies, with their biology. And that I think is really dangerous, because that's not demonstrated in any way, and is very misleading for people.
Yeah, it's a kind of circular process, isn't it? Like, why are you feeling so desperate and miserable? Because you have depression. You have depression because you're feeling desperate. Why are you suffering from extreme mood swings? Because you have bipolar disorder. How do you know you have bipolar disorder? Because you have extreme mood swings. You beliefs and experiences and hear hostile voices because you have schizophrenia. How do I know you have schizophrenia, etc.? So it is circular, and it's in a way it's telling you nothing, but in a way it's also an extremely powerful narrative that has profound consequences for the way you conceptualize your difficulty, where you see yourself as a person mentally ill with all the means that go along with that, for the consequences like the kind of help you're going to seek and the kind and what that might do to you, the pros and cons. And you get, I think the point of applying a diagnosis is very often a turning point in people's lives, and not in a good way. It's when you get redefined, as I like to say it, from person with problem to patient with illnesses. Easily be the start of a 20, 30, 40-year career in psychiatric services, where intervention is piled on intervention, and typically each one embeds you further in this, tragically misguided progression towards, a cure or a treatment that never actually emerges.
It's not, diagnoses they're not explanations, are they? Whereas, but people think they are.
They think they are.
Think that when you've said, oh, you've got depression, it's some sort of explanation, but it's not an explanation at all. It's just our label.
Yeah.
It's basically categorizing a bunch of behaviors in a way, right?
Yes. It's a system of classification.
But from what I've heard, this categorization wasn't there just to help practitioners like you to help other people, basically to see in what criteria these behaviors fit and what kind of help to provide to people. Was that the first intention? I've heard Alan Francis saying a bunch of times, like it should be like a guide, not like just to label similar to diseases or medical diseases. What do you think about that?
Well, Lucy and I might disagree slightly, because I would say that there is some value sometimes in classifying behavior and saying that person is behaving in this sort of a way, which is similar to someone else who I knew who behaved in that sort of a way. And I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with that. But what I think is wrong is that people don't understand it like that. As I say, they think that these words, these terms that we use are explanations when they're not. They're just labels. But Lucy might be more critical than that about that.
Possibly, yes. I mean, I think, in the world we live in, and the people we work with, the people you work with, Joanne, the people I used to work with, we have to use diagnostic labels sometimes. And for example, I would never refuse to put a particular label in someone's benefits application if that helps to get them the support they need, etc., etc. We have to negotiate the rules as it is. I think we need to jettison the whole system. And I think we do need ways of grouping things together, different kinds of experience, kinds of responses to different kinds of difficulty. But the power threat meaning framework, which we're going to come on to, suggests very different ways of grouping things, which actually wouldn't rely on diagnostic labels at all, and isn't a classification system. Classification is a word and a set of assumptions that goes along with kind of the natural sciences, and our position as framework authors is that dealing with emotional suffering is not the correct remit of the natural sciences. This is not fundamentally a problem that can be solved through that lens and through the classification that is usually at the heart of that kind of approach.
Yeah, and classifying these behaviors, maybe it has the opposite effect, because maybe you narrow them down too much and you won't understand the behavior just by looking through the lens of such labels. So because human behavior is so complex, it's extraordinarily complex. I don't think there is any creature that comes close to human beings in terms of behavior. Human beings can read books and they can talk to each other by clicking on some smartphones and so forth. We are too complex. Our behavior is extremely complex. So to narrow it down to depression and so forth, for example, the symptoms that I had, for many, many years, probably they will fit, from what I've read, in so many categories. Like, what am I? All of the devils coalesced into me, and I had all of these behaviors, all of these mental disorders. But so what I understand now is that the way it started is observing the behavior, categorizing it, and probably now trying to find the scientific explanation for it, to go and find the genes or find the chemical imbalances or the brain patterns. Is that how it works now, that they are trying to find a gene connected to these behaviors, like the depression gene or the imbalance, chemical imbalance and so forth? That's the approach. I'm understanding it right?
And is there ever anything physical that a psychiatrist or a psychologist can point to and say, okay, you have this diagnosis?
So not unless you're talking about neurological conditions like, like epilepsy or brain tumors or multiple sclerosis or something like that. There aren't any specific physical markers for any of the major psychiatric conditions like depression or schizophrenia or bipolar. So sometimes if you take a group of people with that diagnosis and you compare them to a group of people with another diagnosis, without any diagnosis, you'll find some differences in their brains. But there will always be enormous overlap. So you can never say that this particular thing actually enables you to say that this person has got this disorder. For example, probably the most replicated finding that people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia have larger brain cavities and smaller brains on average than a group of people who don't have the diagnosis. But there's enormous overlap, and it doesn't mean that you'll ever be able to look at a brain scan and say this person has got schizophrenia or this person hasn't. And then, of course, we've found out recently that is probably at least partly and probably largely attributable to the drug treatment that people have been on, which actually makes their brains get smaller.
But we, at the same time, and this is something critics often accuse us of wrongly, we mustn't fall into the trap of saying, the body is not involved. Of course the body is not involved, but the body is involved in all our experiences, whether we label them normal or abnormal, disorders or not. So our bodies enable and mediate our experiences. So sitting here talking tonight, things are happening in our bodies, our brains are ticking over, all the rest of it. But we don't say that in some sense we're being caused to have a discussion, let alone that what we say is in some distant sense genetically caused. So we need to find models and approaches which include the role of the body, but not in a kind of your low serotonin level has caused your depression way. And there are approaches like that, like the emerging trauma-informed approach, which is, I think, is a very welcome re-emphasis on the role of the body in mediating, expressing distress, such that we need to, I think, include much more body-focused as well as mind-focused approaches. Therapy that happens at a purely verbal level is probably not going to be as effective as therapy which also teaches your body to relax and helps you understand how your body responds under stress and perhaps encourages you to take up exercise or yoga or meditation or whatever. But that's very, very different from a kind of medical disease model.
So all of these studies, because I've read a bunch of studies with twins, for example, showcasing that it's a more likelihood to develop schizophrenia if they study twins, and if one twin has schizophrenia, it's more likely for the other twin to have schizophrenia regardless where the twin is raised, compared to a normal group of twins. So I'm sure you've read through this kind of scientific studies. They don't show anything you think of importance?
You're going to be your answer is better than I would, Joe. I have thoughts about it.
So those family studies and twin studies have lots of problems with them. And what the figures that are usually quoted are the highest rates of twin concordance, whereas actually other studies find much lower rates of identical twin concordance. And there were real problems with the adoption studies, which are also used to justify the idea that schizophrenia, for example, has a genetic basis. Personally, I don't think I think it's quite likely that there is some sort of genetic basis to, that there's some sort of genetic basis to aspects of our personality that may be relevant to certain forms of mental health problems or disturbance. But there's certainly no evidence that, no one's found any particular genes that are associated with anything. So there have been these huge gene studies now that have looked at all sorts of candidate genes for schizophrenia and other mental health diagnoses, and they don't find anything that really don't find any genes that really have any significant effect. They maybe find some genes that have tiny effects, increase your risk by a tiny amount.
And by effects you mean correlation, right?
Yes, yeah.
Because causation is, in this kind of cases, it's impossible to even prove.
Yeah, I mean, in what sense can genes cause particular forms of thinking, feeling, and behaving? It's not obvious to me how that would work, except an impossibly distant causal chain, which would apply to all the ways we think, feel, and behave in all aspects of our lives. So it's partly a pragmatic question: what is going to help us with this person sitting in distress opposite us right this minute? And the gene studies, as far as I'm aware, have never led to a single form of helpful intervention for someone in distress, and are not likely to. And they absorbed, millions of pounds of funding, which could be infinitely better spent. I think it's quite scandalous, really, given effectively what they're finding is this is not a useful avenue to pursue, but it doesn't seem to stop people running further and further studies, and each time their requirements seem to be vaguer, a number of genes all interacting in some incredibly complicated way at some incredibly distant level.
Yes, good. Yeah.
Just look data on serotonin genes, actually, and that's interesting. So you start off with small studies that are suggesting, we think there's an effect with this gene, and some studies show it and some don't. And then there was an idea that maybe there's an interaction between the genes and stress, and people got very excited about that and produced lots of studies showing that. And basically, as the studies got bigger, the effects got smaller. And when they've finally done really big studies, they've shown zero effect, absolutely no effect at all. So all the small effects were basically publication bias. They were people highlighting spurious positive findings and suppressing negative findings, or forgetting about them or ignoring them.
Plus, I wanted to just mention quickly that even if you look at diseases that we can isolate, like cancer, or understand much better, like Alzheimer, you may find genes that are correlated to such diseases, like medical diseases. But even in those cases, it's extremely difficult to say. No one will say if you have those genes or you will develop breast cancer. It's a mix, right, of environment. Even in such cases, let alone when it comes to behavior, I would say.
Well, what the big studies show, for example, is that they can identify some genes that increase your risk of, say, getting diabetes by 1 or 2%, by a tiny amount. So it seems to me that's completely irrelevant. That doesn't tell you anything more than that we're all different and we all have different risks of everything.
And meanwhile, paradoxically, we actually have a mountain of research about the causal impact of all sorts of adversities on mental distress. Poverty, neglect, abuse, deprived environments, generational trauma. There's a mountain of stuff. How come we have this stuff looking it in the face, and we're determined to pursue some kind of, wild goose chase about some genetic solution? I think this is crazy stuff, really. It's crazy making stuff.
Are they pursuing this because of grants and because it's financially more tempting, or why are they pursuing this?
Yeah, well, it's the whole kind of politics of research. I've talked to Richard Bentall a bit about this. He's a very distinguished UK researcher. He cannot be extraordinarily difficult to get his research into kind of social factors in psychosis is his interest. Get it funded. Meanwhile, someone's having tens of pounds of grant money thrown at them to do another, 100% pointless research into distant genetic factors. So that's how it is. I mean, there's complicated reasons for that as well, but we also brought into this sort of biological genetic discourse in a way that is so unhelpful, so pointless, and such a waste of time and money. And it gets hyped, and you read it in the papers. Scientists found exciting genetic contribution to schizophrenia. You never read the retractions, but it all adds to this impression, as you said when you started, that it's all about medical illnesses, and we're halfway to finding out exactly what those are and exactly what their causes are.
I mean, we live in a society that thinks or hopes that science has the answer to everything, don't we?
We do.
And that if you've got a big scanner and you can show a, interesting picture of genes or brain scans or something, that this must be true, this is really clever and it must be true and it must be important. And I think that's just a sort of bias of the modern age, really, that we're optimistic. We think science can explain everything, whereas there are lots of aspects of being human that science doesn't explain, doesn't address well.
But it's also science, right? What you are doing to look at causals from the environment and see how trauma creates these stressful situations and so forth. So maybe they just look at these techno-science solutions that are appear as if they are so extraordinary and so to the point, but they don't look at this more complex set of influences from the environment. It's almost like back in the days, they're looking at the face, the shape of the face sometimes, and they will say if you have a longer forehead, you might suffer from some disease and so forth. The main mental diseases they will call. But what you're doing is also science, right?
Yeah,
it's more scientific, right? If that's
if that's the correct answer.
Yes. I think it is more difficult. I think as soon as you start to, try and measure human behavior, try and bring it down to numbers, you're inevitably oversimplifying things. You inevitably got problems about objectivity, whose perspective you're taking. So I think it's more, it's not science in the sort of simple way. It's not an equivalent to what you do in physics, for example, or even what you do in biology.
The answers ultimately are going to be, largely social, actually, aren't they? What are the root causes of distress? We can use, large-scale scientific studies to find out really interesting things like the impact of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, really valuable research, but ultimately what's going to solve those kind of problems? It's not developing a pill because you've had 6 adverse experiences happen to you in your childhood. It's about thinking about ways in which societies can be fairer or more equal, and relationships can be more constructive, and people can get help with these kind of problems, which will come nearly through some kind of healing, validating relationship with another person. So, that's the kind of route we need to go down. And useful scientific findings they're not ultimately going to come up with solutions in a narrow scientific sense. The solutions need to be personal, relational, social, and political, in my view.
Yeah, Sasha, wanted to say something?
No.
Okay, I wanted, before we go straight into your different approaches, because other people will ask me, okay, but what about autism, for example? Autism seems like a proper mental illness. What do you have to say about that? Is the same category or is something different there? Is more, I don't know. What do you think?
What is it indeed? I'm always getting asked about autism. I'm only going to say very briefly, I've never worked in the field of people who have a diagnosis with autism. And I think it means so many different things. And it's one of those expanding labels. It's almost to say anything about what autism is. I'm personally quite happy to believe that there's a small group of people often who display serious developmental delay at a very young age who may be suffering from some neurodevelopmental problem which we don't yet know much about. But I am worried about the massive expansion of this label to encompass the lives of all sorts of people who, it seems to me, are actually struggling, at least partly, with how to live the kind of lives that, you know, are expected, increasingly expected, the increasingly narrow range of acceptance of being a human being in a society which is exerting more pressures on us. I don't know what do you think, Jo? What's your view on it?
Yeah, but I think that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, I also worry about the expansion of the label. I talk to people who say, "Oh yes, of course, autism is a real thing. Of course, and people who say actually, even at the severe end of the spectrum, there's no sort of hard and fast criteria. There's no real way of distinguishing someone with autistic developmental disorder from other developmental disorder in a clear way." And I agree that I think what's really problematic is that the label has expanded. It seems to have become one of the new terms that people, the new sort of frameworks through which people are framing and understanding their distress and their difficulties. And as with all other labels, I'm afraid that sometimes this distracts people from what the real difficulties actually are.
I think you often hear people saying, well, but I have a kid with autism and whatever I'm doing, I cannot change this kid. Or I have depression and whatever I'm doing, I cannot change this. So it must be something inside me that makes me like that. I've heard this argument many times, as if one validates the other. It shouldn't be like that, I suppose.
Because I've also heard of autism as, strictly a neurological disorder, which I feel like means to people that they can't do much to change it. I'm autistic and that's how it is, and rather than a psychological.
I don't think those two go together. So I read a book by someone who'd been to a special school in New York for people with autism, so-called autism, and this school was set up to teach people some of the skills that they struggled to learn. And the argument in the book was that was something you could do, that some people did struggle with social skills and struggled in certain situations. Whether you want to call that autism or not, I think is another question. But these were things that could be taught to people with patients.
It's kind of very paradoxical, I think, because it seems to me that ordinary people have been in increasing need to apply a label to themselves in order to feel okay about the way they are. And I can understand that drive. And as far as I'm concerned, anyone can call themselves autistic if they like, or what they can call themselves whatever they like. But the paradox is a growing need, it seems to me, to apply a label to yourself in order to feel okay about yourself and the way you are. But actually applying a label is a mark of difference. So it's a kind of uncomfortable kind of false solution, I think, very often to a lot of dilemmas that we're faced with on a daily basis, where the roots go way beyond, I feel uncomfortable in certain situations. I find these kind of things difficult to do. I don't understand these kind of things that go on in other people's lives. It's really, really complicated.
And I think the labels obscure the variety of problems that people have. So it's always better, it seems to me, to try and identify what each individual's specific problems are. And if you just accept, if you just see people in terms of a label, you don't necessarily do that.
Okay, so if in our society we observe behaviors and then we label them, put them into categories, that's what most people do in our society, authorities, those in power, those who are psychologists or psychiatrists. If that's what we do, we put the behaviors into labels and we don't find anything scientific there, really anything physical like a gene and brain and so forth, then how are they curing them or treating them with pills? Then how can you say we we prescribe you this sort of pills for this thing that we don't even know exactly what it is. How come we end up in this situation then?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, clearly, the solution is not appropriate to the problem if you define the problem in the way we have, which is, as I'm sure Joe will say, not to say the psychiatric drugs have no uses, but to describe them as treating or indeed curing the kind of difficulty they're talking about is completely misleading. Indeed, it doesn't happen. Overall, psychiatric drugs do not seem to achieve anything like the kind of even minimal recovery rates that we might hope they would. This is your area, Joe. But,
and we've taken it the wrong way around. So we've given drugs to people. We've assumed that what those drugs are doing is treating some underlying illness, and then we've tried to work out what this illness might be, rather than asking ourselves first of all, what sort of problems does this person have?
Then how come you come up with a drug?
Might they or might they not be helped by a chemical?
Then how come you come with a drug if you don't even know what it is for in this situation?
For many reasons. One reason being that, as I say, the medical profession gained the upper hand in managing people with serious mental health problems and running the asylums, and therefore it became a medical place, and therefore people assumed that medical solutions were what was the right way to deal with these problems. But also because what we're talking about, in some cases anyway, is people who are behaving in ways that are disturbing other people. And some of the drugs we have are tranquilizers, they're sedatives. They do stop people shouting and screaming and running around in ways that other people find frightening or disturbing. So that's one of the reasons why we started with the drugs.
So then they will say that this drug works because you just sedate someone, you tranquilize someone. But do they work or not? I mean, if you use other substances, I think I've read an example from you, John, I think saying if you give beer maybe instead of a pill, and someone improves, his behavior is not as anxious and so forth, do they have a lack of beer in their system? Probably not, so.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, if you've read my stuff, the drugs that were given to people in the old mental institutions were recognized back in the first half of the 20th century to be chemical restraints. No one had any illusions about them being, cures or sophisticated targeting drugs in any way. They just thought they were chemical straitjackets, and they were very useful because it meant they didn't have to use the physical straitjackets quite as often. And it was only in the second half of the 20th century that people started to persuade themselves and persuade other people that these drugs were doing something more sophisticated, that they were targeting some underlying disease. But as I say, that was not because they discovered the disease, but because they wanted another way to think about the drugs they were using.
When I first started working in mental health, in fact, there were more honest description names for these drugs. So major tranquilizers, which are now antipsychotics, very clever piece of rebranding, isn't it? Because it sounds well, targets for whatever it is, the bacterial infection or whatever. And I never heard anyone talk about mood stabilizers. We just talked about lithium, but mood stabilizers again imply some specific targeted action.
Yeah.
Kind of fantasy we all want to believe in, isn't it? Doctors, mental health staff want to believe in it. Patients want to believe in it. Of course they do. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a pill solution to all of this stuff? It's very much the currency, isn't it? Of we all want a pill for our ills. Pharmaceutical companies make a huge amount of money out of it. It's a powerful process, again, of individualizing distress, isn't it? The message is the problem is inside your brain. And, in some senses, it doesn't matter too much whether they work in some sense or not, because it depends what you think the primary purpose of psychiatry and mental health services are. They do a very good job of silencing people and sweeping social casualties out of sight. Whether or not they benefit individual people and enable them to recover is, I think, in some senses a secondary issue.
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say, I remember when I was in school, in high school, and I was maybe 15, 16 years old, I think half of my friends were diagnosed with ADHD or some other kind of disorder, and they were given drugs. And I even thought back then, like, this doesn't seem right at all. I mean, they're just kids, like
Yeah, I find that
little kids, and
horrifying. And what seems to have happened, over the last 20, 30 years is we used to think, there were mentally ill people, but they were a small proportion of the population, and, they ended up being seen as outpatients or perhaps as inpatients, but the rest were normal. And there seems increasingly an understanding which people actively participate in. They seek out these labels that, we're all mentally ill. We've all got depression or got anxiety or got ADHD, and we're vast number of us are on some kind of pill. It's like the medicalization of the entire community, and I think it's horrendous. And I do wonder at what point, when every single person in the UK has got a label and every single person is on some kind of pill, are we going to get to the point where we say, well, what is it about this wonderful society we're living in that is driving everyone crazy and pushing everyone on pill? Do we perhaps need to think more widely? But we certainly haven't reached that point yet. And it kind of astonishes me. And we can see this narrative. I mean, it's particularly interesting to me in a way what's happening with the whole COVID pandemic thing, because never was there a more obvious set of reasons for people to feel very distressed. People are undoubtedly feeling very distressed. And I wrote an article saying, I really disagree with all these headlines about the pandemic of mental illness that's going to result, because you don't need a single new study to demonstrate that being poor, ill, lonely, bereaved and jobless makes people unhappy. We know that. This is a chance to change the narrative. This is a chance to look at the way COVID, for example, has impacted on people's lives in a way that is difficult for all of us, but the impact has been grossly unequally felt. It's really highlighted inequalities in our society. Let's not use this cynically, I think, quite often, research money for more pointless research to build more mental health psychiatric empires, to sell more pills. Let's actually look at the models and use this as an opportunity to get away from this narrative and use the tragedy of the pandemic to build a fairer society. That's my little speech for you.
Very good.
No, that's wonderful, because in the last half, like in 7 minutes or so, last half we will dedicate to your solutions, your approaches. But let's spend 7 or so more minutes about these drugs, because if they don't work, like, why are they even prescribing them? Some will say they should work, else aren't they better than placebo, for example?
Well, as I'm suggesting, they work at some level, but not necessarily with the individual who's taking them. They perform a function, a social function, an important one, I think.
Yeah, I mean, people, if you think about mental health hospitals where people are put if they're really disturbed, there are tranquilizers that help keep people quiet, and they, they do that effectively. And then there are drugs that I think can reduce the sort of intensity of people's psychosis if they have ongoing psychotic symptoms. And then with something like depression, I think antidepressants they just enable society to feel that we're doing something about people's unhappiness. I think probably they don't really have any benefits at all, but yeah, as Lucy says, they enable us to just think, okay, we've dealt with that. We don't have to worry about why so many people are unhappy.
Yeah, because even in the case of cancer, if you study cancer in a petri dish, is not enough. You have to see how it works in the human body, how the treatment works. So more so with human behavior, okay, you may develop some drugs, but the environment should be a lot more important, because you are trying to tackle human thoughts, human behaviors. Like, if they would have given me drugs when I had these problems, I will not have been who I am now. I got a bit angry at the society, but then I started to understand more the society. I wrote books, I made the project, I made documentaries and so forth. it would not be me. So would you fix me, or would you just silence me in a way? It's very tricky to toy around with human behavior like that. I think that's what I'm really bothered about. Don't approach it as if we are the cattle society and you have a medicine for every kind of behavior, because you can't even have that with cancer. We know very well some treatments work better for some people, worse for others. What about human behavior?
Yeah, and I think people don't realize when they take an antidepressant that they are taking something that is changing their brain, and changing it in ways that it wasn't meant to be changed, and causing potential problems that we don't fully understand because we haven't really researched what they actually do overall very thoroughly, and in ways that may not reverse when you stop taking them. We don't know that, so it really worries me that people actually are far too happy to take pills and don't realize that actually they may have serious consequences on the most fine-tuned organ in the body, the brain, and that those so this is relevant because of the emerging problem of withdrawal from antidepressants and benzodiazepines and other drugs. That we were told that this wasn't an issue, and it's becoming clear that actually many people find it very difficult to get off these drugs when they've been on them for a few months, and definitely when they've been on them for longer than that, for years. And that suggests they've altered something. They've changed something in the brain, and the brain is really struggling to get back to normal when you stop taking them.
Yes, because
I was just gonna ask, in generally, how long or how many sessions or how much knowledge about a patient or person that, would you call them patients, do you need in order to, like, generally in order to prescribe one of these drugs?
practitioners know how long does it take probably to prescribe drugs, do you know?
Do you mean how long does your average general practitioner take? I mean, I don't know that we've studied that. I don't know that there's a research answer to that.
Because I mean, just to me, it seems quite, it would be quite shocking, to have only a small amount of information about a person and then to give them a very serious substance that might cause them harm without knowing that much, about whether they really need it or not. And I feel like perhaps that does happen, though.
Yeah, well, there are plenty of stories. I think I came across some recently, actually, of people during the pandemic who'd had, short phone calls from a general practitioner, which had resulted in the prescribing of medication, which is obviously quite shocking. But I would like to think that that's not how it usually happens, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And what is, if you can briefly explain to us, the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist? Can both prescribe drugs? What is the main difference there? Because I think it's a confusion sometimes.
So a psychiatrist is someone who's got a medical training and got a medical degree, and so medically trained people have prescribing rights by automatically. Some psychologists in some countries have been given prescribing rights, haven't they, Lucy? Have some got them in the States?
There's a proposal that psychologists in the UK should have prescribing rights, which I think would be a very bad thing. But psychologists essentially have a 3-year undergraduate degree in psychology and a 3-year postgraduate training. So on the whole, psychologists would be not prescribing drugs. On the whole, they see things more psychologically than medically, and are more and can offer therapy among other interventions. But of course, there's a crossover between the different views. The views don't align, very strictly speaking, with professions. You can see Joanna and I see things rather similarly. They were from different professions, and there are many psychologists who wouldn't agree with my view at all.
And if I have some mental distress, let's say, they will send me to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. How does that work?
I think it's probably different in different countries.
Yeah, in the UK, well, it depends how crazy you are. If you're a family doctor, you get referred to a mental health team. You won't necessarily necessarily see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. You'll see whoever's on duty doing the assessments, and they will refer you wherever to go. But if you want to see a psychologist, you might well have to wait a year or more because they have fast waiting lists. And psychiatrists tend to have much higher caseloads, but to see people for that reason briefly.
I see. Okay, let's focus now, because if we agree that this labeling is quite arbitrary and they could not find anything that's medically sound, let's say, about these mental disorders, and drugs seem to not have much of an impact, maybe except for extreme cases, or maybe not even there. With all of that, how is your approach different? What do you propose? Let's say I'm the society and I'm now freaked out. What can we do about people with mental distress? What can we do about them? What's your approach? How would you change this approach?
Well, I think we do have alternatives and have always had alternatives. So for the whole of my career, my preferred way of working, and this is true of quite a lot of other psychologists as well, was formulation based. So that would be, instead of seeking a label, it would be sitting down with someone, thinking about their life events, the sense they've made of them, the way they've tried to cope, putting together a kind of narrative or story, or it's like an individual kind of personal theory about, so these things happened and you understood it in this way and you coped in this way, and this is the result. And if we think that kind of fits, it will also suggest ways forward. So a formulation is meant to be based, on evidence, like we know about the impact of trauma of various types on people's lives, but also on the evidence that the client brings along to you, what they tell you about what they've been through. So I personally have never found a need to use diagnostic labels, though obviously they've kind of been around in the systems I've been in. And that's one alternative. Formulation-based approaches within a trauma-informed model, I think, are a very encouraging way forward. So the trauma-informed approach, which is gaining a foothold in the UK, comes originally from America, is about, we referred to it earlier, about the very strong amount of evidence about the ways in which adversities and traumas of various types can impact, particularly if they happen to young children, on your mind and your body, basically, and how all kinds of forms of distress that we might label in all sorts of ways can very often be traced back to multiple forms of trauma and adversity. And in some of its recent forms, the definition of trauma has been expanded to include things like poverty and deprivation and racial discrimination and so on. So a formulation-based trauma-informed approach, I think, is a good way forward. And I could, if you want, talk a bit more about the particular project I've been involved in recently, which is a step beyond both those approaches. But do you want to add anything to that, Joanna? Within that, I wouldn't say there's no role for psychiatric drugs, but I would say it's a smaller role, and I would say we would explain what they do and what they don't do very differently.
Yeah, I agree. I suppose the way I see it is that you need to take each individual as an individual, and you need to identify their particular problems, what it is they're struggling with, and then provide help or support them in order to overcome those problems. And that's going to be widely different, even for people who nominally have the same diagnosis. So someone, one person who's supposedly depressed may be struggling with, relationship problems and needs some support with managing that. But another person may have, long-standing problems with self-esteem that need other way, that need support in another sort of way. And people who have psychotic symptoms, as I said earlier, I think some of them can sometimes benefit from some drug treatment, which does help to dampen down symptoms, because sometimes whatever you do, doing all sorts of other things proves inadequate to getting rid of the symptoms, and sometimes the drugs, I think, can be useful. And I think, if someone's really having a crisis or they're having a manic episode and they can't sleep, I think sedatives that help people to sleep can be really useful. And but you will still need, I think, usually to address other aspects of people's lives, other things that they're having difficulty with, things that the psychotic symptoms, difficulties that the psychotic symptoms might be an unusual expression of, an unusual way of communicating about a form of distress that someone has. So I would agree with Lucy, but just emphasize.
So we should focus a lot on individuals and to hear them more and try to work with them rather than put a label.
Yeah, absolutely. And a formulation by definition is tailored to the person. It's individual to the person. It's about that person. I mean, there are very common patterns in the way people present distress and deal with distress, but a formulation is tailored to the individual.
Yeah, and I think I like the idea as well of that you're not treating an individual, you're helping them with their problems.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very picky about language, so I try to avoid words like treatment, because it's not treatment. Treatment is a medical term, and it implies expert gives you this prescription or tells you to do this thing. It's about together to think, well, how can I support you to take some steps forward?
And Lucy, you're practicing this approach?
I'm not currently, but I was for many years, and offering training and, writing about it and so on. But my most, I'll mention this, I think we said we were going to mention this, but my most recent is something called the Power Threat Meaning Framework. And I think you're going to put links on the website or on screen, or perhaps you already have. So it's a massive, long, complicated document, which I won't attempt to summarize in any detail, but very, very briefly, I and Professor Mary Boyle are the lead authors of a 5-year project, which was funded by my professional body, the Division of Clinical Psychology, although it's not an official psychological position. Nobody has to read it, like it, implement it, or do anything with it. But building on the kind of things we've been talking about, the need to move away from a diagnostic model, we have attempted the very ambitious outlining a conceptual alternative to the diagnostic model. So it's a set of principles, a set of ideas, really. It's not a kind of plan for services or do this in this situation document, but it's a set of principles which is based on some core questions which are themselves quite evidence-based. So it's based on core questions about what has happened to you, which in PTMF terms we describe as how is power operating in your lives. That covers a lot of the things we've talked about: relational difficulties, social difficulties, but broader stuff like social norms and expectations, and the results of economic and political policies and so on. How did it affect you? Which we've translated as what kind of threats does this pose to you? What sense did you make of it? And we've talked a lot about the meanings that people attribute to their experiences, but again, meanings at a number of different levels, not just my personal meaning, but the meanings that are around us in society, the meanings we're encouraged to take on. And what did you have to do to survive? In other words, what kind of threat responses are you using? And threat responses correspond very roughly to kind of things we might call psychiatric symptoms. So these questions, which don't have to be asked in any rigid way in that order, in those words and so on, but together they suggest a framework for a kind of narrative which we think will help people to think about non-medical ways of understanding the roots of their distress. At a personal level, we'll put back the links between the threats and the threat responses. At a wider level, helps us to connect personal distress with social conditions, inequalities and injustices, as we've been talking about. So it has implications well beyond therapy, and it's not just about therapy. Indeed, we see it as, the framework doesn't believe in a separate group of people who are mentally ill. It says we all experience distress at times, we all have to struggle and survive the impact of power. We all use various ways of managing our distress. We all make meanings out of our distress. So it's about all of us. It's not just the services. The idea is that it's a kind of tool that ordinary people can use to construct their own stories and think about their own stories if they want. It has obviously wide implications for all sorts of things like research and for economic and social policies and so on. That's a very, very brief summary, but I'm pleased to say that, it succeeded beyond our wildest dreams in attracting attention, because we didn't know if anyone was ever going to read this long and rather indigestible set of documents, and they have. It's been translated into Spanish, actually, both versions, and I've visited Spain 4 or 5 times to do workshops on it. I don't know if I was anywhere near you, but anyway, I enjoyed doing that. It's been translated into 5 other languages. I've spent the last 2 years, I visited 9 countries talking about it, along with the members of the project group. It's led to an enormous amount of interest, which I think is, we like to think it's because it's offering something useful, or in a way, a lot of it isn't new. It's a kind of slightly new way of pulling it together, if you like. And it's not about saying, stop everything you're doing and doing this instead. It's about offering additional validation and support for all the non-diagnostic ways that already exist, but it's also about suggesting new ones. But I think the response does suggest there's an awful lot of people, professional service users, outside services, inside services, ordinary people, feeling this approach that we've been sold for so long really isn't working. We need something fundamentally different. So we're kind of in the second stage of the project, which is about, we set up a committee, which is about collating examples of good practice, disseminating them, encouraging people to carry out research, evaluations. That in itself will feed back into further development of the framework, and we'll see how it goes. But it's all quite exciting at the moment. And we quote Joanna's work because we think that's a really useful perspective on the particular problem of what place do psychiatric drugs have in supporting people in distress.
Yeah, that's great. What would you expect? What would be the best outcome of this to be implemented, to be adopted by the National Health Service as their practice? What would be the best outcome of this approach?
Don't know. It depends at what level you think of implemented. We don't have the power or the desire to push this, or we're very much about pushing it open doors. So it's not about us implementing it. If it's really taken on board, I guess our hope is that this is a small step towards the dissolution and abandonment of the whole diagnostic model of distress, which I think is on its way. I think the conflict we're seeing, Joanna knows all about this, the backlash we get, the insults, the abuse on social media is predictable, given there's a very fundamental challenge to a whole way of thinking, which in jargon terms you could call a paradigm shift. And so we're not claiming to have introduced a paradigm shift. As framework authors, we'd be very pleased, I think, to think that it was a step along the way to letting go of one complete worldview and moving towards another complete worldview. We don't know exactly what it would look like. We don't know exactly what it would look like. Would we even need such a thing as a mental health service as such? If these principles are really thoroughly embedded in our society, which can only happen when our ways of thinking change.
I think it's really impressive, just to say, because it's much easier to criticize what is out there than to really put together a blueprint or some ideas about how things could be done differently. And that's what you've done. And one of the reasons it is so long and complicated, that document, is because it is a very complicated area, isn't it? And what we've needed for a long time, I think, is exactly what you've done, is some pointers towards a different sort of way of thinking and what that would mean for implementing a different sort of service. So yeah, I think it's really impressive that you've done that.
In a way, you are like a detective of human behavior. That's the approach that you have, to see what happened in someone's life in order to give strength to this person to get over those problems or accept them and so forth. It's a fair characterization there.
The framework itself is fundamentally about ways of thinking, I would say, and quite a long way down the line, as a result of those different ways of thinking, you end up with different ways of approaching people and supporting them to think about their difficulties. So, it is, as Joanna says, long and complicated, but oddly enough, some of the feedback we've had is this is common sense and obvious. But so I think it is long and complicated. I think it has to be, because I think we've got so incredibly tangled up in this bizarre way of understanding human emotional suffering. But in the end, sometimes you have to go a very long way around to re-establish common sense. In the end, I think it is about human beings being with other human beings, experiencing distress as we all do, helping each other to heal from distress, helping to build better societies together. In some ways, that's common sense and obvious.
There's been a long-standing debate in psychotherapy, hasn't there, about how directive a therapist should be. So is therapy about the therapist uncovering your problem for you, or is it about the therapist helping you to identify what the problems are, or to find some way of articulating your distress in ways that are helpful to you? So I think what your question was is referred to some of that debate in psychotherapy. And I'm sure that the power threat meaning framework would see the therapeutic process as being one where you're trying to help people to, find their own solutions.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, what the framework is, it's compatible with a number of therapeutic approaches. What it's critical of is the tendency of therapeutic approaches and psychological ones, as well as psychiatric ones, to individualize problems. So the kind of therapeutic approaches, which includes narrow forms of CBT that individualize problems inside your negative cognitions that need tweaking or whatever, would not be in keeping with the spirit of the framework. But many forms of therapy are. But it's a much bigger project than it's about much more than therapy.
It's also about society, of course, in the end, right? Because we have to take care of people. Someone who's a criticizer of our society, Jack Fresco, said something like, if someone goes to the psychiatrist or a psychologist and says, I feel so down, I lost my house, I'm in debt and so forth, and the psychiatrist or psychologist says, okay, it will cost you $50 an hour, come here and I'll solve your problems. That's not, we have to provide support, of course, as a society. It's not always about helping them in sessions and so forth. It's also when they go home and they have to have a proper environment, because they will come back, right? If they go back to a society where, let's be honest, we are thrown into this rat race in this world. Well, you have to make money, make something. It's almost like we cannot stop. Accumulate as much as possible. Someone asked me before this cast, ask them what do they think about these billionaires, because some people name them as psychopaths and sociopaths. What makes them accumulate so much and so forth? Of course, is the environment. So the environment must also change our society. For us, the project that we made is to explain how maybe we should create a better society and take care of people directly, and that will reduce this stress.
Well, indeed, yeah, absolutely. You'll never eliminate distress, and distress is part of the human condition, and we don't have to see it as intrinsically problematic. But no.
Yeah, I agree. I think the other thing about modern society is that we are constantly conditioned to feel inadequate, to feel that we're not doing enough, we're not doing well enough, we're not doing as well as him or her, or all the people around us, and that we should be different. And I do think that's at the root of some of the mental health problems we see today.
I think,
young people, I suspect, social media and constant comparisons about how you should look, feel, behave, the kind of friends you have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Having the kind of lifestyle you should have. I mean, that wasn't around when I was growing up.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is because that's marketed, it's sold, because companies want to make money. So of course, you're not pretty enough because you won't buy makeup if you are comfortable with yourself.
People are making money out of other people's anxieties.
Yeah.
I think
and the more anxious they are, the more they want more of something else, the more you can sell to them, because
exactly, we have to be kept in a state of constant dissatisfaction in consumers, and the as you just referred to, the kind of logical extension of that. You want more. Even $1 billion might not be enough. You might your second.
I think it's the opposite. You might be insane if you're not stressed about this society. That's not a normal reaction, maybe, because it's a very stressful society. So how come that? You know.
And of course, you know, if you medicalize people's distress, you stop the possibility of protest and resistance, don't you? You know, it's a very effective way of keeping people quiet. Oh dear, you're depressed, have this antidepressant and go home. Maybe people should be on the streets making more noise about, you know, wanting things to be different.
Exactly.
There's a way we're not allowed out on the streets.
Sorry, not of course, but yes. At another time.
I know, in a way, it's as if, you know, most people in the society have this runaway slave disorder, or whatever it's called.
Drapetomania.
You know, because everyone's kind of forced to be a slave in this society, so they want to run away from it, and then they get diagnosed with depression or whatever.
Yeah, or if you don't accept the norms and so forth, at least don't call it a disease. Maybe, you know, it's atrocious to me to take human behavior, label it like this, and then call it a disease. To me, I think from my experience, it would not have helped me at all to tell me that I have an illness, because I wouldn't have learned. And also, this is another problem. I was talking to Sasha these days. If people who have more time to understand themselves and have more time, not be so trapped in this rat race, maybe they will not even have to go to a psychiatrist or psychologist in the first place if they have more time to discuss their problems, to think about their problems. But in today's world, you don't have any time. Even when you are at home, you're on the phone because they want your attention and you're scrolling infinitely. Your thoughts, where are they, you know, about yourself and your problems? So probably people don't even have time to deal with their own problems.
It's also so worrying, isn't it, that we're giving this message to children. You mentioned earlier about all your friends being on ADHD drugs when you were younger, and being diagnosed with ADHD. And so we're telling people at a very young age, when they're still forming their personalities and, you know, and also learning how to control their emotions, we're telling them that they've got an illness, that they've got a defect, that they need to take this drug in order to be normal. I think those are really worrying messages to be giving children, and potentially are going to stop them from, you know, developing resources to deal with their problems in a normal way.
Absolutely. I think it's damaging for them even later on in life, I'm sure, because they grew up with this notion that they were messed up in one way or another. They're not normal. And other kids probably treat them that way too, when they know that, oh, he's taking drugs, you know, to be normal.
And also some kids perceive it as punishment. You know, feel that they're being given the pills to be punished for bad behavior, which in some senses they are. You know, they're behaving in ways that other people don't want. And
actually,
you don't take the pills either. So.
I would like our next TROM-Cast. I want to invite someone who is from, it's called Cure Violence. He's from World Health Organization. He worked with the WHO and has these programs, extraordinary programs, looking at the environment to reduce violence. And he did that in America, across America and so forth. And I think that is similar, because that's what we do when we punish people when they do something bad. They steal or whatever they do, we put them in jails. Like Thomas says, I think he said, you caught people with drugs that they wanted to take, and you put them in jails and give them the drugs that they don't want to take, kind of, you know. And I think that should be the approach. For me, it's, of course, you know, you look at the environment, you take care of human beings, so you prevent these behaviors. You don't go on this model that I call the cattle society, almost like made livestock of ourselves, that you have to like 10, 15 minutes for each patient or whatever, however much you have, and you give them pills and everything seems to be fine, which is not fine. That's why I loved both of your works, because I was reading through your works and you really emphasize on the importance of focus on the individual and the environment, and you have to take care of individual people, not label them and give them medication. I think it should be like of course, in our society, but it's not. And that's extremely bothering to me, you know. Yeah.
We seem to ended up agreeing.
Yeah.
would this be a good time to draw it to a close? Because I can hear my kids getting my dinner ready.
Yeah, if you want to say something in the as a closing statement or whatever, where people can find more about your work and so forth.
Follow the links that I think are up on the talk.
Yeah, you have several books, right? Several books. You have a Joanna, she has a blog.
Thank you for inviting us. Yeah, for inviting us to a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you so much. I love this. And maybe in the future, maybe if you want to participate, because we will do other podcasts about similar subjects, maybe I can drop you an email, and who knows, maybe you can reply back.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks a
Have a
lot.
good evening. Bye.
Thank you so
Bye
much.
bye.
Bye, Lucy.
Bye. Thank you. I think that'll be fine, actually. I don't need to see that.